things aren't always what they seem. Hi everybody, it's Sarah from Hushed Up History, and I invite you now to come, sit down, get a drink, relax, and settle in, because I have more stories to tell you. We're going to talk about a famous mummy. Maybe. And we're going to talk about a ghost. Sort of. What is for sure is that this first story is one of my all-time favorite historical conspiracy theories, and I am very happy to tell you the tale. Enjoy. On January 13th, 1903, David E. George made the decision that his time had come. Locked inside his room at the Grand Avenue Hotel in Enid, Oklahoma, he ingested a lethal dose of arsenic and left the world behind. And this may not have been a huge shock to anybody who knew George. He had left behind a very heavily shaded past in Texas before moving to Enid and taking on a job as a house painter. And he was not good at his job. Stumbling along on a bad leg and ranting and quoting Shakespeare as he went, he was a known alcoholic, and this is probably why his landlady, Mrs. Harper, paid no attention to the confession that he made just before he took his life. And this was not the first time that George had attempted to take his own life or made the same strange claim. 9 months earlier, he made the same bizarre confession to the wife of a local minister before his unsuccessful attempt. But this attempt was successful, and like so many bodies before him, he was brought to W.B. Penniman's mortuary and furniture store. But his last words to Mrs. Harper and the minister's wife made this no ordinary corpse. I'm just going to jump back here for a second. W.B. Penniman's mortuary and furniture store. There you go. Anyway, the combination of the arsenic ingested by George and the chemicals used in his embalming essentially mummified him, and the store, with no one coming forward to claim the body, decided to use him as a prop. Dressed in a suit with glass eyes gleaming and a newspaper in his hand, the body of George sat propped up in a chair in the parlor showroom of the shop. He remained there, day after day after day, but his final words swirled in the minds of the locals. Could what he said actually be true? The stories lingered and lingered and lingered, and then one day, a lawyer named Finis Langdon Bates arrived in town, and when he did, he went directly to Penniman's to claim that body. He had been looking for this man for 25 years, but he didn't know him as David E. George. He knew him as John St. Helen. But Bates said that wasn't his real name either. Bates said that at their last meeting, he made a confession to him, and it was the same confession that he had made to the minister's wife, and it was the same confession that he had made to his landlady before ingesting that lethal dose of arsenic on that January evening. According to Bates, this was not David E. George. This was also not John St. Helen. According to him, the corpse sitting on display in Penniman's mortuary and furniture store was Abraham Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth. The story of the Lincoln assassination is well known. On the night of April 14th, 1865, Abraham Lincoln, his wife, and friends attended a play at Ford's Theater, where he was shot by the actor John Wilkes Booth. And according to all formal history accounts, Booth leapt from the presidential box, landing on the stage and breaking his leg before stumbling out into the night and escaping the scene. For 12 days, Booth was on the run until he was cornered in a barn by Union troops, who set the barn ablaze and started shooting into the building. Miraculously, through all the smoke and chaos, one of the bullets hit Booth in the neck, and he died several hours later. This is the story that we all know and that has been passed down through time. But almost immediately, rumors started swirling that the man killed in the barn that night was not John Wilkes Booth, with multiple people saying that the corpse looked nothing like the dark-haired, mustachioed, and very well-known actor. But the rumors and the whisperings went nowhere. As far as the U.S. government was concerned, the man who killed Abraham Lincoln met him in death that night. In the late 1870s, Finis Bates was a young lawyer practicing in Granbury, Texas, when he was approached by a man who introduced himself as John St. Helen. St. Helen had arrived in Granbury years earlier and claimed that he was a shopkeeper that needed Bates' legal assistance in obtaining a liquor license. Over time, Bates began to notice that there were some things about John St. Helen that made him stand out from everyone else in town. He carried himself with a very distinct sort of poise and refinement. He very often quoted Shakespeare, and he was very, very deeply interested in any theatrical performance that happened to come through the town. Bates described St. Helen as indescribably handsome, with his thick, dark, curly hair and mustache, but he also sensed that he was deeply tortured, stating, quote, "He had acquired a restless, haunted, worried expression constantly on his face, while the flashes which came from his keen, penetrating black eyes spoke of desperation and capacity for crime." And that darkness sensed by Bates revealed itself to him several months later when he was summoned to meet with John St. Helen. When he arrived at the address, he found John St. Helen in bed, being tended to by a doctor who was trying to keep track of a rapidly fading pulse. The doctor told Bates that St. Helen was near death and requested to speak to him alone. The doctor left the room, and when Bates spoke to his rapidly declining acquaintance, he was told something that was beyond belief. St. Helen was extremely weak, but he mustered up any shred of strength he could to let Bates in on his secret. And he told Bates that his name was not John St. Helen, that his name was John Wilkes Booth, and that he was the man who had killed Abraham Lincoln. Bates documented the entire admission, but it did little good. John St. Helen did not die that night, and as soon as he could, he vanished from Granbury. Bates was completely convinced that the confession was real, and he immediately contacted the United States Army, telling them everything that had happened and urging them to reopen the case and hunt down the man calling himself John St. Helen. And their reaction to this new information was a very firm no. According to the Army, the man who killed Abraham Lincoln died after being dragged out of a burning barn 12 days after one of the most tragic and unbelievable crimes that the young nation had ever seen. And that was it. Bates dropped it, but he never forgot. 25 years later, Bates was living in Memphis, Tennessee, when he stumbled on a interesting news article. It was about a man named David E. George who had just succeeded in his second attempt to take his own life after claiming that he was actually John Wilkes Booth. And when Bates saw the photographs side by side that were printed in the newspaper showing the similarities between David E. George and John Wilkes Booth, all he saw was the face of John St. Helen. When Bates arrived at W.B. Penniman's mortuary and furniture store, he found himself face to face with John St. Helen for the first time in a quarter of a century. He asked to take custody of the body, but Penniman's wasn't very eager to let it go. The corpse in the chair with its gazing glass eyes had become a sort of tourist attraction for the shop, and they wanted to keep it that way. Bates had waited 25 years to find John St. Helen, and he had spent every year in between meticulously researching John Wilkes Booth and diving deeper and deeper into the theory that he may have escaped the barn that night. He never let his theory go. He certainly was not going to give up on the body. As intriguing as the story was, no one really wanted to take full responsibility or handle maintenance of this corpse of Booth George St. Helen, except for Bates. Finally, in between the years of 1904 and 1907, his wish was granted. Legally, since he was the lawyer for David E. George's alias John St. Helen, he was able to finally take custody of the body. And he did, taking it home and keeping it in a coffin-shaped box, both in his house and sometimes in his garage. But this was not enough for Bates, and in 1907 he published a 300-page book entitled The Escape and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth, written for the correction of history. And in it he claimed, quote, "It is to the American people that I appeal, that they shall hear the unalterable facts, that the death of America's martyred president was not avenged, as we have been persuaded to believe." And then, in order to drum up publicity for his corpse and the accompanying book, he began to rent the body out, lending it to all manner of traveling carnivals and circuses who all put it on display, claiming that it was the mummified body of John Wilkes Booth. But over time, the corpse began to develop a bad reputation, allegedly bringing bad luck to whoever brought it on tour. Showmen and circus employees that found themselves working near the mummy were suddenly finding themselves in unexpected financial ruin. Then, in 1920, a circus train that was carrying the body and traveling to San Diego crashed. 8 people died in the accident, but the mummy left the wreck totally unscathed. When Bates died in 1923, his widow had absolutely zero interest in continuing to rent out the corpse, and she sold it to the Carnival King of the Southwest, William Evans, for $1,000. When Evans finally retired from show business, the mummy went with him to his new Idaho potato farm, and he continued to advertise to anyone coming through that for a price, they too could still take a look at the corpse. In time, Evans did attempt to bring the body of Booth back out on tour, but the attempt was wildly unsuccessful, and in 1930, the battered and beaten body was sold to Joseph and Agnes Harkin for $5,000. Harkin was completely convinced that this was the body of John Wilkes Booth, and then went on to offer $1,000 to anyone who could prove to him that it was not the assassin. And in 1931, someone took him up on the offer. A team of Chicago doctors led by Dr. Orlando F. Scott took the body and led a thorough examination. Because John Wilkes Booth was such a high-profile and such a well-known actor in his time, multiple injuries that he had sustained throughout his life were also very well known and very well documented, and this team of doctors started to look for evidence of these injuries on the corpse using x-rays. And some of the results were curious. Early in his career, Booth had crushed his thumb in a stage accident, and this mummified corpse did show evidence of an old injury to a thumb. The shoe size for this corpse would have roughly been the same size of the boot worn by Booth at the time of the assassination. Also, there was evidence of a broken leg, and it is well known that Booth, after jumping from the presidential box onto the stage, did break his leg before escaping the scene of the assassination. There was also evidence of old scars on the body that did match scars that John Wilkes Booth had. There were factors that made people believe that this mummy was not that of Lincoln's assassin, one of which being that the broken leg was said to be the opposite leg to the one that Booth broke when he jumped onto the stage. But despite these discrepancies, the team of doctors said that it was possible. It was possible that this mummy was John Wilkes Booth. And with that, the body went back on display, with advertisements flying wildly, inviting everyone to come see what was now being called, quote, the world's greatest educational attraction. But this declaration from Dr. Scott was not enough to retire the corpse from the traveling sideshow circuit. The circus charged 25 cents to anyone who wanted to walk up and get a close-up look at the corpse. They also offered a reward of thousands to anyone who could prove that it was fake. The company also cut a hole in the back of the heavily dried out cadaver, and anyone who was bold enough was welcome to take a peek inside. Those who were not able to see the corpse in person could read all about it in the July 11th, 1938 issue of Life magazine, who ran a story about the alleged mummy of John Wilkes Booth alongside multiple photos of the extremely emaciated, dried-out shell of what was once a man. The interest in the alleged Booth mummy ebbed and flowed over time. An author would write something about it. A magazine would write something small about this now nearly mythological, battered and beaten body. But nothing seemed to be enough to entice an actual serious study of the corpse and its origin. After the 1950s, the location and the owner of the alleged body of John Wilkes Booth becomes a mystery, with its last sighting being known as taking place in the 1970s. It is believed that the mummy may have finally come to rest in the hands of a private collector, but, like the identity of the corpse, nothing has been proven. Did John Wilkes Booth, the man who killed Abraham Lincoln, pull off the ultimate escape that April evening of 1865 and leave someone else to fill his grave? It is a theory that has circulated and been pondered for years and years, but there's never been an outcome, and it's never changed the story told in our history books. John Wilkes Booth was one of the most famous actors of his day, and he built his career taking on roles from the works of Shakespeare. But it has yet to be proven if two of his most convincing roles were that of David E. George and John St. Helen. The calendar page had barely just turned over into a new year, and 29-year-old Francis Smith was having the worst day of his life. He sat before court that day completely morose and utterly distraught over what he had done. And on that evening of January 3rd, 1804, there was no hesitation. He had immediately surrendered to the authorities, deeply, deeply regretting how everything had unfolded. Now, all he could do was ask for mercy and understanding. After all, in that moment, he truly believed that he was acting on behalf of the entire borough when he shot the gun. Over the course of the last 12 months, the West London district of Hammersmith had steadily fallen into a state of anxiety and fear. It all began when a local man decided to take his own life, and in a move that went against all typical rules and beliefs of the time, his body was buried in the consecrated ground of the local churchyard, and because of that, many people believed that his soul would never actually find peace. It was after this controversial burial that many people started to report sightings of a figure draped in white wandering throughout various parts of Hammersmith. And to the people of Hammersmith, this was obviously the tormented soul of the man who took his own life and was then committed to consecrated ground. What other explanation could there possibly be? If the incidents had remained as ghostly sightings, it may have never progressed beyond being another haunted tale. But then the encounters started to get violent. And then people started to die. A brewer's servant named Thomas Broom later told the story about how he and a friend were walking through a churchyard one night when he was suddenly and violently grabbed by the throat. It was only when his friend turned around that he said the spectre, quote, "gave me a twist round, and I saw nothing. I gave a bit of a push out with my fist, and felt something soft like a great coat." Another pair of stories allege that two separate women encountered the same malevolent spirit near the same churchyard, and that their encounters were so terrifying that both of them ran home, refusing to leave their beds, where they then died several days later. The people of Hammersmith were scared, but there were some that were also skeptical, believing that this was not a ghost that they were dealing with, that it was actually just a cruel and devious human being. But whether it was a ghost or whether it was a human, the reign of terror had to be stopped. Hammersmith did not have a formal police force set up at the time to protect its people, so some of the citizens decided to take the task onto themselves, and they would go out at night armed and patrol the streets. And one of these people, guarding the night armed with a shotgun, was Francis Smith, alongside another night watchman named William Girdler. And on that fateful evening of January 3rd, 1804, at approximately 10:30 p.m., Girdler ran into Smith and told him that later on in the evening they would meet up and hunt down the ghost together. Girdler, after all, knew what he was looking for. He had claimed that only a few nights earlier, on December 29th, that he had seen the specter, and that he chased it down before it disappeared into the night. Another man walking the streets of Hammersmith that night was 32-year-old bricklayer Thomas Millwood. He had been visiting his mother, father, and sister, and as the clock approached 11 p.m., he stood up, said goodbye to his family, and walked out the front door to head home for the evening. His sister Anne watched as he walked away from the house, and she wished that he had just listened to her. He was wearing his work clothes, which consisted of a pair of linen pants, a waistcoat, and an apron, all of which had been freshly washed. And as she watched him move further and further into the darkness, he basically glowed against the night. She recalled how her brother had already been mistaken for the Hammersmith ghost twice, and how every time, every accusation was met with a scoff. It was not long before Anne heard the voice cutting through the night. "Who are you? What do you want? I'll shoot you if you don't speak." And then she heard the gunshot. Anne, without hesitation, ran out into the night, and what she found was horrifying. She found her brother in the road, in a pool of blood, his face mangled by the gunshot. But they were not the only two there. Also on the scene with his body was a local wine merchant named John Locke, Francis Smith, and William Girdler. What happened spilled out of their mouths quickly. Locke had heard the gunshot, and not long after, Smith ran up to him, extremely distressed and panicking, telling him that he had just shot a man, and asked him to come back to the body with him. When they got there, they were quickly joined by Girdler and Anne. When the authorities arrived at the scene, Francis Smith immediately took full responsibility for what had happened, and he was taken to Newgate Prison to await trial. The body of Thomas Millwood was taken to the Black Lion Inn, where surgeons determined that the bullet had entered through his jaw, killing him instantly. Smith's trial began 1 week later, and it may have seemed very straightforward. He fully admitted to shooting Millwood. But it was not that simple. Despite taking full responsibility for Millwood's death, Smith entered a plea of not guilty, based on the fact of him stating that he knew he was not hunting a ghost that evening, that he was looking for a man dressed as a ghost that had been terrorizing Hammersmith. He said that when he saw the figure in white, he knew it was a man, and that he had called out twice, asking him to state his name. It was when the man did not state his name, but continued to move toward him, that he said he began to fear for his life. He said that he did shoot, but that he never had an intention to kill, and that where the bullet landed and Millwood's death was all an unfortunate accident. There was no witness to the shooting, so heavy reliance was placed on the accounts given by those few people who arrived at the scene after Millwood had already passed away. Locke stated that when Smith ran up to him and then asked him to accompany him back to the body, that he was genuinely distraught and absolutely horrified as to what had happened. And multiple other people also spoke in court about Smith's honesty, good character, and general integrity. It seemed that the only person speaking out against Smith was Anne Millwood, who claimed that he shot his gun so quickly after calling out to her brother that he never even had a chance to respond. Smith may have had lots of people vouching for him, but Lord Chief Baron MacDonald was hearing none of it. He addressed his jury and plainly stated that there was no gray area here. It was either a murder or it was not. That Smith had gone out into the night with a gun, showing that he did have an intent to harm someone, and that Millwood was simply walking home when he met his end. In the judge's eyes, this was not self-defense because Millwood did nothing to warrant Smith shooting the gun. He also stated that it did not matter who Smith thought he was hunting down, and it also would not have mattered if Millwood was dressed as a ghost to haunt Hammersmith. It did not warrant being shot. According to the judge, no matter how this was spun, Millwood was shot out of malice, and that was why Smith had to be charged with murder. Surprisingly, the jury did not go along with what the judge said, and when they came back into the courtroom, they brought with them a guilty verdict, but not guilty of murder. They said that they found Smith guilty of manslaughter, but the judge was not hearing this and said that this was not possible. They could not find him guilty of manslaughter because it was not an option. Their only options were guilty of murder or acquitted of murder. And with no other avenue to go down, when the jury reconvened, they were forced to come back with their outcome. And Francis Smith was found guilty of murder. And with the verdict came the sentence. Francis Smith was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to be hanged and then dissected the following Monday. Smith completely broke down inconsolable and had to be carried from the courtroom. As hard-lined as the judge was, he was also very aware of how strong the public opinion was that Smith should not be treated as a cold-blooded killer. So, he added to this, "The case, gentlemen, shall be referred to His Majesty immediately." This gave Smith one more chance. If a court case was presented to the king, he had ultimate rule to override or change a sentence, and in the case of Francis Smith, these few words from the judge saved his life. Before the sun rose the next morning, his sentence had been reduced to 1 year of hard labor in prison. The Hammersmith ghost, the terrifying being accused of attacking citizens and causing turmoil, suffering, and even death, was never seen or heard from again. And that is because 2 days after the death of Thomas Millwood, the Hammersmith ghost came forward. A local shoemaker named John Graham came forward and admitted to being the Hammersmith ghost. He had been dressing up in all white, impersonating the specter in order to scare his apprentices as an act of revenge after they had scared his children with ghost stories. He turned himself into the authorities, but they weren't sure what to do with this. There was no legal precedent for what he had done. So he was released on bail, and he does not appear in any further records after that. Francis Smith was given a full pardon on July 14th, 1804. While the haunting hoax came to an end, the case of the Hammersmith ghost had far-reaching implications in the legal world. It exposed that there was very little defined in law for someone who either misread a scenario or someone who took action believing that it was being taken with good intention. Did mistaken belief warrant a criminal charge? Smith took full responsibility for the death of Millwood, but at the time, he believed he was acting against someone who was terrifying the people of Hammersmith. This scenario was brought up over and over and over again in multiple court cases until it was finally settled in 1983 with the case of Regina versus Williams. The people of Hammersmith were living in fear of a supernatural entity, and the story of the ghost is still told today, but not in front of campfires or on gloomy nights when the veil feels especially thin. The Hammersmith ghost died the same moment as Thomas Millwood and was carried on not as a spine-tingling story out of West London, but as a cautionary tale and a legal precedent that hung over courts and haunted lawmakers for almost 2 centuries before it was finally put to rest.